The air in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel glittered with diamonds and dripped with old money. At the center of it all was tech billionaire Arthur Pendelton, a man who could buy and sell entire countries before breakfast. Tonight, he was dancing with a woman half his age, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. The only problem, she wasn't his wife. His wife Genevieve was watching from the shadows. Everyone thought she was a victim, a beautiful, tragic figure. They were wrong. What they didn't know is that she had a plan, a microphone, and a secret that wasn't just about to end a marriage, but an entire empire. Stay tuned, because this is the story of how one woman took back everything, and then some. The weight of the Bivilgari Serpenti necklace felt less like a privilege and more like a collar. Genevieve Pendelton stood before the full-length antique mirror in her Fifth Avenue penthouse, the cold, diamond-encrusted scales a familiar pressure against her skin. Each of the 77 carats seemed to represent a lie she had swallowed, a betrayal she had endured in silence. Outside the sounds of New York City, a distant siren, the hum of perpetual traffic were a muted symphony, insulated by triple-paned bulletproof glass. Her life was a fortress of wealth, and she its most prized prisoner. Tonight was the annual Metropolitan Children's Foundation Gala, the crown jewel of the city's philanthropic season. It was an evening she once anticipated with genuine excitement. She had co-founded the charity with 2 other society wives 15 years ago, long before her husband's company, Pendleton Systems, had become a global behemoth synonymous with revolutionary AI and data processing. Back then it was just Art, a brilliant, hungry coder with a chaotic vision, and she was the one translating that chaos into business plans, securing their first rounds of angel funding while working a full-time marketing job. She had been his partner in every sense of the word. Now Arthur Pendelton was no longer Art. He was a titan, a predator, in a bespoke Brioni suit. And she was Mrs. Pendelton, a name that felt more like a job title than an identity. Her role was simple: to be elegant, to be silent, and to be the perfect hostess, smoothing over her husband's rough edges and social brutalities with a practiced smile and effortless grace. "Are you ready yet, Jen?" Arthur's voice boomed from the master suite's entryway. He didn't wait for an answer, striding in while adjusting the cuffs of his Patek Philippe watch. It was the Grandmaster chime, a $7 million piece of engineering he'd acquired at a Sotheby's auction last year. He didn't buy it for a love of horology. He bought it because he could, and because his rival Jameson Croft wanted it. "Almost," she replied, her voice a carefully modulated calm. She turned from the mirror, her silver gown by Oscar de la Renta shimmering under the soft lighting. She had chosen it specifically for its ethereal, almost ghost-like quality. Tonight she wanted to be underestimated. Arthur gave her a cursory glance, his eyes scanning her as if she were a balance sheet. "Good. The car is waiting. Don't forget to talk to Robert Iger. I need him on our side for the media merger." He spoke of the Disney CEO as if he were a chess piece to be acquired. There was no "please, no, let's." There was only "I need." This had become the grammar of their marriage. "Of course, darling." Genevieve said the endearment, tasting like ash on her tongue. As they descended in the private elevator, the silence between them was thick and suffocating. It was a silence born not of comfort, but of 1,000 unsaid things, a chasm of resentment that had widened over the years. She remembered the early days sharing cheap pizza on the floor of their tiny Queen's apartment, dreaming of a future that looked nothing like this cold, sterile opulence. The dream had been about building something together. But Arthur had forgotten the together. He saw Pendleton Systems as his sole creation, his monument. She and their two now adult children were merely decorative elements in the grand architecture of his life. The final straw had not been a single event, but a slow, agonizing erosion. It was the discovery of the other women, first whispers, then a receipt carelessly left behind, and finally blatant, arrogant indiscretion. The current one, a sharp-featured marketing executive named Crystal Monroe, was the most galling. She was a caricature of ambition, all sharp angles and predatory smiles. Arthur wasn't even trying to hide her. He had promoted her at a subsidiary company, paraded her at private events in the Hamptons, and as Genevieve's private investigator had confirmed, with a soul-crushing portfolio of photos, installed her in a lavish condo overlooking Central Park. A condo owned by a shell corporation, linked directly to Pendelton Systems. That was his mistake. He had mixed his sordid personal life with his business, and in doing so, he had given her the key. For the past 6 months, while playing the part of the devoted, oblivious wife, Genevieve had been waging a silent war. Her nights were spent not at galas or cocktail parties, but in a small rented office in the financial district, with a team of forensic accountants and a bulldog of a lawyer named Nina Sharma. They had started by pulling on the thread of Crystal's condo and had unraveled a tapestry of corruption so vast and intricate it took their breath away. The elevator doors opened to the marble lobby. The doorman, a kind man named Patrick, who had seen her children grow up, tipped his hat. "Good evening, Mrs. Pendleton. You look beautiful tonight." "Thank you, Patrick," she said, giving him a genuine smile. It was perhaps the only honest expression she'd worn all day. As she slid into the back of the waiting Maybach, the cool leather a stark contrast to her racing pulse, she glanced at Arthur. He was already on his phone, barking orders at some unfortunate underling. He didn't even notice her. To him, she was just part of the scenery. He had no idea that the scenery was about to catch fire. The necklace felt heavy, but her heart, for the first time in a decade, felt strangely light. It was the lightness of a decision made of a path chosen. The cage was gilded, yes, but tonight she wasn't just going to walk out of it. She was going to melt it down to the ground. The grand ballroom at the Pierre was a sensory overload of power and privilege. A sea of couture gowns and expertly tailored tuxedos flowed around islands of white linen and towering floral arrangements, the air thick with the scent of lilies, and Dom Perignon vibrated with the low murmur of 1,000 conversations deals being brokered, alliances being forged, and reputations being quietly dismantled, all under the guise of charity. Waiters navigated the crush with silver trays held aloft, their expressions impassive. Genevieve moved through it all with the practiced ease of a monarch in her own court, a queen whose kingdom was crumbling from within. She exchanged pleasantries with a senator from New York, discussed the latest contemporary art acquisition with the director of the MoMA, and promised to attend a luncheon for a cause she couldn't remember. Each smile was a feat of engineering, each laugh a perfectly timed deflection. She was a master of this game, this delicate ballet of social survival. All the while her eyes scanned the room, a hawk searching for its prey. Arthur had abandoned her the moment they arrived, drawn into a tight circle of venture capitalists and tech journalists, like a shark to chum. He was in his element, holding court, his voice rising above the din as he pontificated on the future of quantum computing. He was selling them a vision, the same one he had sold her 20 years ago. The difference was, she now knew the prospectus was fraudulent. And then she saw her. Crystal Monroe made her entrance, not with a bang, but with a calculated silent assertion of presence. She wore a crimson Chanel gown, a slash of defiant color, in a room of muted pastels and classic blacks. It was a dress designed to be noticed, clinging to her athletic frame and leaving one shoulder bare. Her dark hair was slicked back, severe, and modern, showcasing diamond earrings that Genevieve recognized instantly. They were from Graf, a custom pair she herself had pointed out to Arthur months ago, only for him to claim they were a bit ostentatious. Apparently they weren't too ostentatious for his mistress. Crystal didn't scan the room nervously like a newcomer. She moved with the unearned confidence of someone who believed she had already won. Her eyes locked onto Arthur's group across the room, and a small, triumphant smirk played on her lips. She began to weave her way through the crowd, not towards Arthur directly, but on a trajectory that would inevitably place her in his orbit. It was a move of calculated nonchalance, designed to look like a coincidence to the ignorant, and a power play to those in the know. Genevieve felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach, but her expression remained serene. She watched as several society matrons women she'd known for years followed Crystal's progress with narrowed eyes and whispered behind their gloved hands. They knew. Of course they knew. In their world, secrets were currency, and Arthur's flagrant affair was the talk of every private dinner party from Park Avenue to Palm Beach. Their pity felt like acid. They saw her as a relic, a woman clinging to a title, while her husband openly courted her replacement. Let them whisper, she thought. Let them judge. Their small, petty world was about to be turned upside down. Her ally, David Chen, materialized at her elbow. He was Arthur's executive assistant, a quiet, fiercely intelligent man in his late 20s who had been with the company for 5 years. Publicly, he was the picture of loyalty, anticipating Arthur's every need. Privately, he was disgusted by his boss's megalomania and corruption. He had been Genevieve's eyes and ears inside Pendleton Systems, the anonymous source who had first confirmed her suspicions, and then, at great personal risk, provided her with the internal documents that formed the bedrock of her case. "Mrs. Pendleton," he said, his voice barely a murmur. "Everything is in place. The supplementary press kits are with the contacts at the Times and the Journal. They're waiting for your signal." "And the board?" she asked, her gaze still fixed on Crystal, who was now laughing at something one of the venture capitalists said, her hand briefly touching Arthur's arm. A jolt, sharp and painful, went through Genevieve. "The emergency clause has been cited. They have been notified to expect a priority communication at 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. They think it's about the merger." David's face was a mask of professional calm, but she could see the tension in his jaw. He was risking his entire career. "Thank you, David, for everything." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes conveying a depth of gratitude that words could not. "You know what to do after I make the announcement." "I do. Be safe," he said, before melting back into the crowd as seamlessly as he had appeared. The orchestra, nestled on a dais at the far end of the ballroom, finished a classical piece, and after a brief pause, transitioned into something slower, a classic Sinatra tune. It was the signal for dancing. Couples began to drift towards the polished marble floor. Genevieve watched as Arthur, with a theatrical sigh, as if capitulating to some great demand, extricated himself from his circle. He walked directly towards Crystal Monroe. He didn't even glance in his wife's direction. He extended a hand, and Crystal took it, her crimson dress flaring as she allowed him to lead her to the center of the dance floor. The room seemed to hold its breath. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. It was one thing to have a mistress. It was another to dance with her at the year's most public charity event in front of your wife, in front of the entire world. It wasn't just an indiscretion, it was a declaration. It was an act of supreme, untouchable arrogance. Genevieve stood perfectly still, the champagne flute in her hand, trembling ever so slightly. She watched them, a handsome couple, wreathed in soft light and beautiful music. Arthur leaned in and whispered something in Crystal's ear. Crystal threw her head back and laughed a sound that even from across the room sounded like shattered glass. That was it. That was the final public humiliation he had engineered. But he had miscalculated. He thought he was shaming her. He didn't realize he was emancipating her. She placed her untouched champagne flute on a passing waiter's tray. Her spine straightened the Bulgari necklace, now feeling less like a collar and more like armor. It was time. The center of the dance floor became a stage. Under the warm, forgiving glow of the crystal chandeliers, Arthur Pendelton and Crystal Monroe were the undeniable stars. Frank Sinatra's "Fly Me to the Moon" poured from the orchestra, a timeless melody for a scene of breathtakingly modern betrayal. Arthur, for all his moral failings, was a surprisingly graceful dancer. He led with an easy confidence, his hand placed firmly on the small of Crystal's back, his fingers splayed possessively against the crimson Chanel. He held her closer than was appropriate for a public dance, their bodies brushing against each other in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. He was a man marking his territory. Crystal, for her part, played her role to perfection. She gazed up at him with an expression of pure adoration, her head tilted, just so her lips slightly parted. She was the ingenue, the captivating force for whom a great man would risk everything. It was a carefully rehearsed performance, and the entire New York high society was their audience. From her vantage point near the grand archway, Genevieve observed every nuance of their sickening theater. She saw the way Arthur's thumb stroked the bare skin of Crystal's back, the proprietary smile on his face as he caught the eye of a rival CEO across the floor as if to say, "See what I have. See what I can get away with." He wasn't just dancing with his mistress. He was wielding her like a trophy, a testament to his own power. He believed he was above consequences, above the judgment of these people, and most certainly above the feelings of the woman whose name he still shared. Genevieve analyzed Crystal with a cold, detached precision. Was this love, or was it something harder, more transactional? She saw the ambition glittering in Crystal's eyes, a hunger that matched Arthur's own. Crystal wasn't just sleeping with the king. She was angling for the throne. She saw Genevieve not as a person, but as an obstacle to be removed, an outdated model to be replaced. The glances Crystal shot across the room weren't just for Arthur. They were for the society wives, the board members' spouses, the women in Genevieve's circle. They were little victories, each one a twist of the knife. The song swelled, and Arthur spun Crystal out, then pulled her back in their movements, fluid and synchronized. The crowd around them had formed a subtle, unspoken circle. Some watched with prurient glee, others with second-hand embarrassment. A few the wives who had faced their own private heartbreaks looked towards Genevieve with expressions of deep, sorrowful pity. They thought she was trapped, that her only option was a quiet, dignified retreat, followed by a messy but private divorce, where she would be paid handsomely for her silence. That was the traditional route, the playbook for the wronged billionaire's wife. Genevieve had torn that playbook to shreds months ago. She felt a strange sense of disassociation, as if she were watching a film of her own life. The pain was still there, a dull, chronic ache deep in her chest, but it was overshadowed by a cold, clarifying rage. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. That was a deep and personal wound, but it was only a symptom of the greater disease, Arthur's absolute corruption. The man dancing with abandon in the center of the room was a fraud in every sense of the word. He was a fraudulent husband, a fraudulent philanthropist, and as she was about to prove, a fraudulent businessman. The music shifted to a gentle close, the final notes hanging in the air. Arthur and Crystal did not part. He kept his arm around her waist, his lips brushing her temple as he whispered something that made her smile. They stood there for a moment, too long, bathed in the applause for the orchestra soaking in the attention and the scandal. It was their coronation. That was her cue. With a composure that would later be described in news reports as chilling and superhuman, Genevieve began to move. She did not storm or rush. She glided. Her silver Oscar de la Renta gown seemed to float around her as she navigated the tables and the clusters of stunned onlookers. People parted for her, as if by instinct, their conversations dying in their throats. The whispers followed her like a ripple in a pond. It's Genevieve. What is she doing? Oh, this is going to be a scene. They expected tears. They expected a slapped face, a thrown drink, a screaming match. They were about to be deeply disappointed. Arthur and Crystal finally noticed her approach. Crystal's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of anxiety, quickly masked by a defiant lift of her chin. Arthur's expression was one of pure annoyance. He saw her not as his wife, but as an interruption, a social inconvenience about to spoil his perfect moment. "Genevieve," he said, his voice low and menacing. "What do you think you're doing? Don't make a scene." She didn't even look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the stage where the gala's host, a well-known morning show anchor, was preparing to introduce the next speaker. She walked past her husband and his mistress, without a word, her path unwavering. She ascended the 3 short steps to the dais, her posture as straight and unyielding as a marble column. The host, a man named Brian McAllister, turned, his professional smile freezing on his face. "Genevieve, what a surprise. Are you here to say a few words?" He ad-libbed, clearly bewildered. "Just a few," she said, her voice calm and steady. She reached out and gently but firmly took the microphone from his hand. She felt its cool, metallic weight. It felt like a scepter. The entire ballroom had fallen silent. The clinking of cutlery, the murmur of conversation, the shuffling of feet, it all ceased. 300 of New York's most powerful people were staring at her, a captive audience. She turned to face them, the spotlight finding her making the silver of her dress and the diamonds of her necklace blaze with an almost holy light. Her eyes swept across the room, past the sea of shocked faces, and settled for a brief, cold moment on her husband. His face was a thundercloud of rage and disbelief. He still thought this was about the dance. He still thought this was about Crystal. He was a brilliant man, a visionary in the world of technology. But in this moment, he was a fool. A fool who had underestimated his partner, and who was about to learn, in the most public way imaginable, the true meaning of the word consequence. The silence in the grand ballroom was no longer just a lull in the festivities. It was a physical presence, heavy and absolute. Every eye was fixed on the woman on the stage, bathed in the solitary spotlight. Genevieve Pendleton held the microphone, her knuckles white, but her hand steady. She looked out at the faces, some curious, some gleeful, some horrified, and she felt a profound sense of clarity. For years she had been a ghost in her own life. Now she was about to become the most solid thing in the room. She brought the microphone to her lips. The soft electronic hum as it activated was the only sound in the cavernous space. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice resonating with a calm authority that surprised even herself. It was crisp, clear, and utterly devoid of the hysteria everyone was expecting. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight to support the Metropolitan Children's Foundation. As some of you know, this cause is deeply personal to me. We started this foundation with the simple belief that every child deserves a chance, a safe harbor, a future free from fear and deception. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. It was a perfect anodyne opening. A few people visibly relaxed, assuming this was just an unscheduled but heartfelt plea for donations. Arthur, standing frozen on the dance floor, looked momentarily relieved, though his eyes still burned with fury at her audacity. "Deception?" Genevieve repeated her voice, dropping slightly, taking on a harder edge. "It's a powerful word. It's what happens when the truth is hidden to protect the guilty. When a carefully constructed image is presented to the world, while a rot festers just beneath the surface." Her eyes left the general audience and locked directly onto her husband. The spotlight seemed to stretch, creating an invisible high-tension wire between the stage and the dance floor. "For 15 years you have known me as Mrs. Arthur Pendelton, the wife of a visionary, a philanthropist, a titan of industry." She smiled, but it was a chilling, razor-thin expression. "Tonight I want to introduce you to the man I know, the real Arthur Pendelton." A collective gasp went through the room. This was it. The scene everyone had been secretly hoping for. Crystal Monroe, still standing beside Arthur, turned pale under her perfect makeup. "You see him standing there," Genevieve continued, her voice gaining strength, each word a precisely aimed dart. "A man who just enjoyed a rather intimate dance with his colleague, Miss Crystal Monroe." She said the name with deliberate, icy precision. "Many of you have whispered about them. You've seen them at polo matches in the Hamptons and in quiet corners at exclusive restaurants. You've pitied me. Well, I appreciate the sentiment, but I don't need your pity. What I need is for you to know the truth. Arthur isn't just a man who cheats on his wife. That in a room like this is sadly almost pedestrian." A few nervous, scandalized chuckles rippled through the audience. Arthur took a step forward, his face purple with rage. "Genevieve, that's enough security," he bellowed, his voice cracking. But no security guards moved. David Chen had, as instructed, quietly informed the head of hotel security that Mrs. Pendleton would be making a special announcement, and that under no circumstances was she to be interrupted. They, like everyone else, were frozen, watching the drama unfold. Genevieve's gaze did not waver. "Oh, I'm just getting started, Arthur. You see, your infidelity is the least of your crimes." The room, which had been buzzing with the scandal of a public marital spat, fell silent once more. This was a new, unexpected turn. "My husband, the great philanthropist who is here tonight asking for your money for needy children, is a thief. He is a liar. And he has been using Pendleton Systems, the company I helped him build from our one-bedroom apartment, as his personal piggy bank for years." The accusation was so stark, so outrageous, that it was met with stunned disbelief. This wasn't just a domestic dispute anymore. This was a corporate assassination. "He talks about transparency and stakeholder value," she said, now pacing the small stage, her energy commanding the entire room. "But what he doesn't talk about is Project Nightingale." "Does that name ring a bell, Arthur?" Arthur's face, which had been a mask of rage, was now one of pure, unadulterated shock. The color drained from it. He looked as if he'd been shot. Crystal beside him looked utterly bewildered, her own part in the drama suddenly seeming small and insignificant. "Project Nightingale," Genevieve announced to the silent, rapt audience, "is the official internal code name for a systematic 5-year-long scheme to defraud the investors and shareholders of Pendleton Systems. It involved inflating revenue figures through a series of shell corporations, one of which, a lovely little entity called Aurelius Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands, was used to purchase a certain luxury condo for Ms. Monroe over there." She pointed a finger directly at Crystal, who flinched as if physically struck. The crowd erupted in a cacophony of gasps and frantic whispers. Phones were surreptitiously being raised, their small red recording lights blinking like malevolent eyes in the dim light. It involved falsifying performance metrics to trigger executive bonuses that Arthur pocketed to the tune of over $90 million. And it involved selling proprietary sensitive user data, your data, to private intelligence contractors in direct violation of your terms of service and federal law. She stopped pacing and stood center stage. The microphone was no longer just a tool, it was a weapon, and she was wielding it with devastating effect. "So yes," she concluded, her voice ringing with the clarity of absolute conviction. "By all means applaud the man, the great Arthur Pendelton, a man who will steal from his partners, his shareholders, and his customers, all while dancing with his mistress on the donations you give to sick children. The truth is, the only charity work he's ever done is for himself." She lowered the microphone. For a moment, there was nothing but a ringing silence. Then, with a quiet, deliberate movement, she didn't just place the microphone back on the lectern. She opened her hand and let it drop. The thud and screech of feedback that echoed through the ballroom's state-of-the-art sound system was the most definitive sound of the night. It was the sound of a life being shattered, of an empire beginning to fall. It was the sound of the truth finally hitting the floor. The feedback from the dropped microphone sliced through the ballroom's stunned paralysis, a sound as ugly and final as a guillotine's fall. In that moment, the carefully maintained veneer of high society cracked wide open. The scene devolved into chaos, but it was a chaos of whispers and pixels, not shouts and shoves. The real violence was happening on phone screens and stock tickers. Arthur Pendelton stood as if petrified, his face a ghastly shade of white. The man who commanded boardrooms with an iron will, who could eviscerate a rival with a single sentence, was utterly silent. His mind, a machine of legendary processing power, seemed to have short-circuited. He looked at Genevieve, who was now calmly descending the stage steps, and for the first time in their 20-year marriage, he saw her not as an accessory or an afterthought, but as a terrifying and unknown force. He had been so busy building his empire that he'd forgotten he'd built it with a queen, not a pawn. Crystal Monroe reacted differently. Her survival instincts, honed in the cutthroat worlds of marketing and social climbing, kicked in. The adoration in her eyes was replaced with cold, hard panic. This wasn't the plan. She had hitched her wagon to a titan, not a criminal defendant. She took a step back from Arthur, then another, a subtle physical disassociation that a dozen gossip columnists noted with scribbling pens. Her crimson dress, once a symbol of defiance, now looked like a warning flare. She was trying to distance herself from the explosion, not realizing she was standing at its epicenter. Meanwhile, Genevieve moved with a preternatural calm. As she walked toward the ballroom exit, the crowd parted for her as if she were a biblical prophet. No one dared to meet her eye. They were afraid of the righteous fire they saw in them, or perhaps they were afraid of what she might know about their own secrets. At the doorway, David Chen was waiting, holding her coat. He had already executed the next phase of the plan. "It's done," he said quietly, his face impassive. "The kits were released to the press contacts the moment you said, 'Project Nightingale.' The SEC and the Southern District of New York received their copies via secured courier 5 minutes ago. A Form 8K is being drafted by the legal team to notify the market of a material event." "Thank you, David," she said, slipping into her coat. "Go home. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." She stepped out into the cool night air, ignoring the frantic calls of "Genevieve" from her so-called friends, and the first pops of paparazzi flashbulbs from the street. A black town car, not the Maybach, pulled up to the curb. Her lawyer, Nina Sharma, was in the back seat. As Genevieve got in, she didn't look back. She knew what she was leaving behind, a conflagration. Inside the ballroom, the digital wildfire had begun. The attendees, a cross-section of the financial and media elite, were furiously typing on their phones. Pendleton Systems and Project Nightingale began trending on Twitter within minutes. Financial reporters who had been at the gala as guests were now in full work mode, dictating frantic copy to their newsrooms. The value of Pendleton Systems, a public company, was tied to its reputation, and that reputation was currently being shredded and set ablaze in a $100,000-a-plate ballroom. The first news alerts hit phone screens before the waiters had even cleared the appetizers. Bloomberg Pendleton Systems plunges in, after-hours trading, following damning accusations by founder's wife at charity gala. The Wall Street Journal, Genevieve Pendleton alleges massive Project Nightingale fraud scheme implicating CEO husband Arthur Pendelton. The New York Times at glitzy Manhattan, Ball, a corporate empire, is rocked by public betrayal and allegations of criminal conspiracy. The company's board members scattered around the room, huddled together in a panicked cluster. Their phones were vibrating incessantly with calls from investors, regulators, and their own terrified families. The multi-billion-dollar media merger Arthur had been so keen on, it was dead. No company would touch Pendleton Systems now. The immediate priority was survival. An emergency board meeting was called for 7:00 a.m. the next morning. Arthur was finally snapped out of his stupor by the hotel's head of security, a discreet man in a dark suit. "Mr. Pendleton, I think it would be best if you left. We can escort you out through a private exit." Arthur simply nodded, his arrogance shattered. He looked around for Crystal, but she had vanished, swallowed by the panicked crowd. She had abandoned ship. As security flanked him, leading him through a service corridor smelling of disinfectant and boiled vegetables, the humiliation was complete. He was no longer a titan being celebrated. He was a liability being extracted. The evidence Genevieve had unleashed was not just anecdotal. The press kits David had distributed contained excerpts of damning documents, falsified quarterly reports, signed by Arthur internal emails, discussing the Nightingale revenue manipulation and transaction records from Aurelius Holdings. It was a meticulously assembled case designed for maximum impact and irrefutability. This wasn't a he said, she said. This was a she said, and here are the notarized receipts. The unraveling was swift and brutal. By the time Arthur reached his car, the after-hours stock ticker showed Pendleton Systems PNSYS down 28%. That number represented over $40 billion in shareholder value, evaporated in less than an hour. His personal net worth had plummeted by at least $10 billion. It was one of the most catastrophic, self-inflicted corporate implosions in modern history. And it was all because he thought his wife was just a pretty ornament. He failed to understand that the woman who had helped him build his empire knew exactly where all the structural weaknesses were. She knew which walls were load-bearing and which were hollow facades. And tonight, with a single, well-aimed swing of a microphone, she had brought the whole rotten structure crashing down. The empire wasn't just unraveling, it was being systematically dismantled by its own architect. The dawn broke over a city that feasts on scandal. The story of the Pendleton Gala was a banquet. The front pages of every newspaper were a variation on the same theme. Photos of Genevieve poised and elegant at the microphone were juxtaposed with images of Arthur ashen-faced and haggard being bundled out a side door. Crystal Monroe's face was everywhere, a modern-day Hester Prynne branded not with a letter, but with a Chanel dress the color of blood and ruin. For Arthur, the morning was a descent into a fresh hell. He had spent the night in a suite at the Carlisle Hotel, his penthouse suddenly feeling like enemy territory. He hadn't slept. He'd watched his life's work disintegrate in real time on cable news. At 6:00 a.m., his chief counsel called. The conversation was brief and brutal. The SEC had frozen his personal assets pending an investigation. The board had formally suspended him as CEO and chairman, effective immediately. He was ordered not to contact any employee of Pendelton Systems. In the space of 8 hours, he had gone from master of the universe to a pariah locked out of his own kingdom. The 7:00 a.m. emergency board meeting was a bloodbath conducted over Zoom. The members whose own reputations and fortunes were now at stake were merciless. The motion to remove Arthur was unanimous. The discussion then turned to the catastrophic leadership vacuum. The company was in freefall. They needed a leader who projected stability, who knew the company intimately, and who most importantly had unimpeachable credibility. As they debated candidates, a proposal was put forth by board member and old family friend Michael Devereux, a man Genevieve had secretly met with weeks prior. His proposal was audacious: appoint Genevieve Pendelton as interim CEO. The suggestion was met with stunned silence, then a flurry of arguments. She wasn't an operator. She hadn't been involved in day-to-day business for years. But Devereux argued forcefully. Who knows this company better than the woman who helped build it, who has more credibility with the public and with regulators right now? She is the ultimate whistleblower. Appointing her is not just a strategic move. It is a profound statement. It says we are cleaning house from the very top. It is our only move to save this company. The logic was inescapable. By 10:00 a.m., the board had voted. Genevieve Pendelton was offered the position of interim chief executive officer of Pendelton Systems. For Crystal Monroe, the fallout was just as swift, but far less corporate. She was fired from her marketing position via a curt email from HR before she'd even had her morning coffee. Her corporate cards were cancelled. The locks on her company-sponsored condo were scheduled to be changed by noon. Her name was toxic. The society pages that had once chronicled her rise now detailed her spectacular fall. She was no longer an ambitious executive. She was a homewrecker and a potential co-conspirator in a massive financial fraud. Friends stopped returning her calls. The invitations to exclusive events, which had once filled her inbox, ceased entirely. She was an outcast, her glittering future extinguished overnight. The Graf diamond earrings, which had felt like a crown, now felt like shackles. Genevieve, meanwhile, spent the morning not in celebration, but in preparation. She was in the midtown offices of her law firm Sullivan & Cromwell, a name that carried the weight of 100 years of corporate power. Surrounded by her legal team, she was gaming out the next 48 hours. When the call came from Michael Devereux offering her the CEO position, she accepted, with the same calm resolve she had shown on stage. There was no surprise, no hesitation. This had been part of the plan all along. Her first act as interim CEO was to issue a public statement. It was broadcast live from the law firm's press room. She wore a simple navy blue suit, her hair pulled back. The opulent Bivalgari necklace was gone, replaced by stark professionalism. Yesterday evening I took drastic steps to expose a profound betrayal of trust at the highest levels of Pendelton Systems. She began, her voice steady. I did not do this out of spite, but out of a deep and abiding duty to the company I co-founded, to its thousands of loyal employees, and to its shareholders and customers who placed their faith in us. The actions of Arthur Pendelton represent a deviation from the core principles upon which this company was built. That deviation ends today. she announced a full independent forensic audit of the company's finances, pledging complete cooperation with all regulatory investigations. She assured employees that their jobs were safe and that the company's vital work would continue. She wasn't playing the victim or the scorned wife. She was a leader taking control in a crisis she herself had precipitated. The market, which had been bracing for a complete collapse of the company, reacted with cautious optimism. The stock, which had opened down another 20%, began to stabilize. Appointing the whistleblower as CEO was an unprecedented move, a sign of such radical transparency that some investors saw a viable path forward. The human drama, however, was far from over. Late that afternoon, as Arthur was preparing to meet with his new, extremely expensive criminal defense attorney, 2 FBI agents in dark suits arrived at his hotel room. They presented him with a warrant for his arrest on charges of securities, fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The image of Arthur Pendelton, the tech visionary, being led from the Carlisle in handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief, became the defining photo of the scandal. The fall was complete. He had flown too close to the sun, blinded by his own brilliance and arrogance. He never imagined that the person who knew the secrets of his wax and feather wings was the woman sleeping in the bed next to him, and she had just watched him fall to earth without flinching. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal maneuvering and corporate triage. Genevieve's move was not a simple act of revenge. It was the opening move in a complex and brilliantly executed queen's gambit. She had sacrificed her queen, her privacy, her marriage, her old life, to checkmate the king and seize control of the board. Her new office was Arthur's old one, a sprawling corner suite on the 60th floor of the Pendleton Tower with panoramic views of Central Park. The space was a monument to masculine ego, dark mahogany, polished chrome, and an enormous abstract painting that was more of an investment than a piece of art. His personal effects were already packed into boxes, a silent testament to the swiftness of the coup. Genevieve ordered it all removed. She wanted a blank slate. Her first week as interim CEO was a masterclass in crisis management. She held a company-wide town hall broadcast to all of Pendleton's global offices. She stood not behind a lectern, but in the center of the stage, speaking without notes. She was candid about the challenges ahead, but resolute in her vision for the future. She spoke of returning to the company's founding ideals of innovation and integrity, the ideals she had helped write. She spoke of a new culture of transparency and accountability. For the thousands of employees who had grown disillusioned under Arthur's tyrannical reign, her words were like rain in a drought. They gave her a standing ovation. This was a war fought on multiple fronts. The legal front was a minefield. Arthur, out on a $50 million bail, had assembled a legal dream team to fight the charges. His strategy was clear: paint Genevieve as a bitter, vindictive spouse, emotionally unstable and unqualified, to run the company who was manipulating evidence to steal his life's work. It was a nasty personal attack, designed to undermine her credibility, but Genevieve and her lawyer, Nina Sharma, were prepared. They had not just brought accusations, they had brought an army of evidence. David Chen, now promoted to Genevieve's chief of staff, became a key witness for the prosecution, providing a detailed roadmap of the fraud. He had kept meticulous records encrypted and stored off-site of every dubious transaction Arthur had ordered him to make. He was the loyal soldier who had finally decided to serve the kingdom, not the corrupt king. Furthermore, the forensic accountants Genevieve had hired had been working for months. They presented the SEC and the board's independent investigators with a report that was over 1,000 pages long, detailing the Project Nightingale scheme with irrefutable clarity. They had traced the flow of money from inflated revenue streams into offshore accounts, and then back into slush funds used for Arthur's extravagant lifestyle, including the financing of Crystal Munro's brief, glittering career as a kept woman. Crystal herself was facing her own indictment for conspiracy, her attempts to portray herself as an innocent victim crumbling under the weight of financial records showing her as an active participant in the concealment of funds. The corporate front was just as critical. A faction of the board loyal to Arthur and unnerved by a woman taking such decisive control began to push back. They initiated a proxy fight, attempting to rally shareholders to oust Genevieve and install a CEO of their own choosing. They argued she was a transitional figure, not a long-term leader. This was the moment Genevieve had been waiting for. She hadn't just been collecting evidence of Arthur's crimes. She had been quietly leveraging her own considerable but often overlooked assets. Over the years, through her divorce settlement, from a first brief marriage and savvy personal investments, she had accumulated a small fortune of her own. For the past year, she had been using it to strategically purchase Pendleton Systems stock on the open market through a series of discrete trusts. Moreover, she held a significant block of founders' shares that Arthur, in his arrogance, had never bothered to try and take from her. She now revealed her hand. At a tense shareholder meeting, she announced that she personally controlled 12% of the company's voting stock. She had also spent weeks speaking personally with the heads of major pension funds and institutional investors who held another 25%. She presented them with her long-term vision for the company, a plan for restructuring, for investing in ethical R&D, and for rebuilding trust. She contrasted her detailed, sober plan with the old guard's vague promises of a return to stability. She won. The shareholders voted overwhelmingly to support her leadership. The proxy fight was crushed. Her position as CEO was no longer interim, it was cemented. In one of her final moves to consolidate power, she addressed the past. She used company funds to settle a number of harassment and wrongful termination lawsuits from female employees who had been pushed out by Arthur over the years. It was a costly move on paper, but its value in rebuilding the company's culture and public image was immeasurable. It sent a clear message: the age of impunity was over. Arthur watched it all from his gilded cage, a penthouse he could no longer afford, his movements tracked by an ankle monitor. He was watching the woman he had dismissed as a decorative object systematically and brilliantly dismantle his legacy and build her own from its ashes. He had played the game of kings, believing he was invincible. He never realized he was playing chess with a grandmaster who saw the entire board and was 10 moves ahead. His gambit had been to flaunt his power. Hers was to take it. 6 months later, the Pendleton Tower was a different place. The culture of fear that had permeated the executive floor under Arthur had been replaced by a quiet, focused intensity. The dark mahogany in the CEO's office had been swapped for lighter woods and glass, the imposing abstract painting replaced with a rotating display of art by emerging female artists. The change was more than aesthetic. It was symbolic of a new era. Genevieve Pendleton was not just keeping the seat warm, she was forging a new throne. Her leadership style was the antithesis of Arthur's. Where he managed by intimidation, she managed by consensus. Where he demanded loyalty, she earned it. She promoted from within, elevating talented executives, many of them women who had been sidelined by her husband's cronyism. She invested heavily in the company's beleaguered ethics department, giving it real power and autonomy. The Project Nightingale scandal had been a near-death experience for the company, and Genevieve was determined to ensure such a disease could never again take root. The results were starting to show. The stock price, while not yet at its frothy pre-scandal peak, had recovered and stabilized. Institutional investors, impressed by Genevieve's steady hand and transparent leadership, were reinvesting. The media merger that Arthur had coveted was dead. But Genevieve had brokered a new, smarter strategic partnership with a German tech firm, one based on mutual respect and shared technological goals, not a hostile takeover. The reckoning for the old guard was absolute. Arthur Pendelton's trial was a media circus. Despite his high-priced lawyer's best efforts to portray him as the victim of a conniving wife, the mountain of evidence presented by the prosecution was insurmountable. David Chen's testimony was particularly devastating, as he calmly and methodically detailed years of financial manipulation, all at Arthur's direct command. After a 6-week trial, the jury took less than a day to find him guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison, a stunning downfall for a man who had once been on the cover of Forbes. The image of him being led from the courtroom, his bespoke suit looking baggy, and his face a ruin of defeated arrogance, was the final punctuation mark on his story. Crystal Monroe took a plea deal. In exchange for her testimony against Arthur and the forfeiture of all assets he had given her, the condo, the jewelry, the cars, she received a reduced sentence of 18 months for conspiracy and money laundering. Her testimony, tearful and self-serving, painted herself as a manipulated pawn, but the court records showed her as a willing and greedy participant. She would serve her time not in a high-security prison, but in a low-security facility, often called Club Fed. Yet her real sentence was the permanent destruction of her reputation and future prospects. She had gambled for a queen's life and ended up with a felon's record. One cool autumn afternoon, Genevieve stood in her office, looking out at the sprawling expanse of Central Park. The leaves were turning, painting the landscape in hues of gold and crimson. Her chief of staff, David Chen, entered with a tablet. "The final SEC settlement has been approved by the board," he said. "We pay the fine, we implement the new oversight protocols, and this chapter is officially closed." "Good," Genevieve said, turning from the window. "What's next on the agenda?" "A review of the Q4 budget for the AI Ethics Initiative, and then your call with the Chancellor of Germany." It was just another day in her new life. There were moments late at night when the ghost of her past life would surface, the memory of a young man's laugh in a tiny queen's apartment, the sting of 1,000 small betrayals. The scars were there, but they were no longer open wounds. They were reminders of the price she had paid for her freedom and her power. She hadn't set out to destroy her husband. She had set out to save herself and the company she still believed in. In the end, she had done both. She had walked into the gilded cage of her own accord, but she had walked out as the master of a new kingdom, one built not on lies and arrogance, but on the solid foundation of hard-won truth. The reign of Arthur Pendelton was over. The reign of Genevieve Pendelton had just begun. And so the empire built on lies crumbled in a single night, not by a market crash or a hostile takeover, but by a woman who refused to be a footnote in her own story. Genevieve Pendelton's story is a chilling reminder that the most dangerous secrets are often the ones hidden in plain sight. She traded a Bulgari necklace for a CEO's chair, and in doing so, she didn't just get revenge, she got justice. She proves that the quietest person in the room is often the most powerful, waiting for the perfect moment to change the world. What do you think was Genevieve? A hero? A ruthless strategist? Or both? Could you ever do what she did? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. This story is a testament to the power of truth, and if you believe stories like this need to be told, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to our channel for more true-life dramas that are stranger than fiction. Thank you for watching.